And joining us right now, he is an adult dyslexic practitioner. It is Mike Stiles. Mike, good evening to you, sir.
G'day, Pat. Lovely to be here.
Yeah, thanks for joining us. Look, I've just told my story, right, in some detail. I tend to be a tad long-winded. I can blame my dyslexia for that. No, I've just told my story in quite detail. Basically my story that I talked about to you before we came on here. And I saw it in the news today that you have presented a petition. Let me bring up the story of One News. You have presented a petition to Parliament because the New Zealand's approach to dyslexia is ignorant, and you've given this petition to Parliament. Tell me about the petition. Tell me what you're trying to achieve with it.
Right. Well, the context for the petition, of course, is, Pat, that 10% of humans worldwide, and therefore 10% of Kiwis, have dyslexia.
Right.
That's about 75,000 children, by the way.
Right.
But we as a nation have a level of ignorance about dyslexia. It was started effectively by the ministry, who effectively denied its existence until 2007.
Yeah, that's bizarre. That's weird to me.
It is bizarre. There are reasons for that. One of them is, of course, what doesn't exist, you don't have to fund.
Right. Okay. Yep.
But secondly, and probably an equally significant reason, is the fact that up until then, in fact, it still exists, New Zealand had a program called Reading Recovery.
Yep. Now,
Reading recovery still exists in schools, and it does help some children who have got behind for whatever reason.
Mm-hmm.
But the woman, Dame Mari Clay, who was the champion and developer of Reading Recovery, managed to convince first of all, the Department of Education, and then more recently the Ministry of Education, that all reading problems could be solved by reading recovery.
Right.
Now, the reality is, of course, some can be, but if the reading issue was down to dyslexia, it's most likely in the pure reading recovery form doesn't do a lot of good, because reading recovery is a program where you get more intensive but more of the same. Yeah. And what happens for me, and I've had countless parents relay this to me, that their child who has dyslexia and because of that struggles with reading, writing and spelling often gets taken out of the subject they like, and that might be sport or social studies or science, and taken away and made to do more of the thing they don't like.
Yeah, right.
Anyway, for whatever reason, and of course, to be fair, Pat, the dyslexia is an issue that's only really come to everyone's mind in the last 30 or so years because of brain science.
Yep.
Because we understand a lot more about the brain, the way the brain works. But secondly, it's come about in the last 2 decades, I suppose, because of the mapping of the human genome. So we've been able to make links between particular genes and human behavior. And for example, there are 40 genes that are now linked to dyslexia. And depending on how many of those genes you inherit, your dyslexia can be very serious,
yep,
or relatively minor. Now, sorry.
I was going to say as well about the reading thing, just so people know this, is it's not like people hear the word dyslexia, and I guess I've heard it many times, forget my own experiences, and you hear about things like letters being the wrong way around and words going off the page and that sort of thing. It's probably pretty good to explain to people, from my perspective at least, is for me it was never an issue of reading. It was an issue of inputting the written word. Like I can read, fine. Like I don't have any of those little quirks or things about the words. Although sometimes I realize I get to the end of a paragraph and I have no idea what I've just read. So I can read perfectly well. But what I learned was if I get given instructions in writing, sometimes I can't understand them. But if someone speaks to me literally the exact same words, like reads off the
Yep.
sheet to me, I understand it just fine. So for me, there's an input of the written word, which of course then when you're running your own fucking business and you've got to do admin and stuff is the worst thing in the world. But it's the input of the words as opposed to the words themselves. That's how it works for me.
Yep. So a layman's definition of dyslexia would be intelligent people who struggle with text. They struggle with reading, writing, and in particular, spelling. Spelling is the most challenging one. And because of that, of course, writing becomes a challenge. You've just described that reversal of letter things is largely disproved now. It's more to do with maturity and development. So many, people with dyslexia, teenagers on, they're not likely to reverse their letters. There is a related condition, however, in the suite of neurodiverse conditions called Irlen syndrome.
Okay.
It's a slightly controversial one, but that's the one where words seem to jump around on the page and move off the page. You can have Irlen syndrome and not dyslexia, and you can have dyslexia and not Irlen's, in the same way that there's a suite of conditions. So there's dyslexia, there's dyscalculia, there is
Dyspraxia, is that in there?
dyspraxia, now called developmental coordination disorder. I don't know why they didn't just say dyspraxia was a bit quicker. There's ADD and ADHD, and then there is autism spectrum disorder, and then a lot of other minor ones. So they are the major ones. There's another one called dysgraphia, which people sort of write like a spider on a page.
Yep.
But the dyslexia, dyscalculia, ADHD, Irlen's and autism spectrum disorder are the main ones.
Can I ask you this as well? I'm fascinated about this 2007 thing, yeah? And the reason I'm fascinated about that is I don't know whether it was my subconscious telling me something in 1989 where something I saw kind of made sense. But there was a Cosby Show episode in 1989 where Theo, right, the son, does all this kind of work. He learns all these things about the test he's going to take. He knows everything there is to know when his parents are testing him. He goes and takes the test, and then he comes away from that, and he gets a really bad grade. And they can't understand why. And the whole episode is about what's going on here. And then there's this new thing they discover called dyslexia. And they wonder if this has got a part to play in it. Now, I know this is probably not the done thing in polite company today with what's happened with Bill Cosby, but I think we can still use this as an example of when people figure it out. This is Theo when he came home from school the day he went to get the assessment for his dyslexia. Now, I understand when being diagnosed how freeing that was, like how all of a sudden a whole bunch of stuff made sense. In 1989, this is how they showed it on the Cosby Show.
Hi.
Hi.
Hey. Miss Roscoe gave me the test results back.
And?
What did she say? You guys, I'm dyslexic.
No, and I don't know why I remember that, but I remembered that, forget my own sort of diagnosis, but before that, I remember that like it was yesterday. And that was 1989 on New Zealand televisions. So when you say 2007, I'm like, well, hang on, there's 18 years between it being popular enough to be on a sitcom to an education sector acknowledging it. There's something wrong with that equation.
Yes, there is. There's a lot of things wrong with it. But so I was, for my sins, Pat, a classroom teacher until 1999.
Yeah.
I was in the classroom. The mantra amongst school teachers in a secondary school setting was, if any parent came along to school and said, oh, my son or my daughter has dyslexia, the teachers would say to themselves, oh, that's just an excuse for a child who isn't succeeding at school. So there was an absolute denial. And the sad thing is, of course, two things are very sad. One, many of those teachers who in their teacher training way back then, they did their teacher training in an environment where dyslexia didn't exist. But the multiply sad thing is, today in 2022, teachers can still go through pre-service training and receive no instruction at all on identification of dyslexia or what to do about it. So the old definition of stupidity is keeping on doing the same thing but expecting a different outcome. And that could just about summarize what's happening. Teachers, when I deliver sessions to teachers, even those who are kind of working closely in the space bemoan the fact that they're still not getting any professional development in this area. So the ministry, I have to say, dropped the ball and hasn't since picked it up. But some of your comments before about, for example, the Theo in the Cosby Show, the reading, writing and spelling issue is like the obvious external symptom.
Yeah.
The same way that spots on your hand or spots on your skin is a sign of measles, but measles is much more than that.
Yeah.
Or COVID-19 is a cold and sniffles, but we also know that underneath that there's a hell of a lot more. So there's a hell of a lot of other symptoms that aren't so obvious that are linked to neurodiversity dyslexia. So we know that people have a poor short-term memory.
Mm-hmm.
We know that they have poor time management and organization skills.
Yeah, wow.
We know that processing speed is often slower, either verbally or cognitively slower. We know that they have difficulty often sequencing. That's relating things in the correct sequence. We know that they have slower automaticity. That's a fancy name for if you repeat a task a number of times, it can become automatic. And the best example of that is driving a car.
Right.
We know also that they are often very clumsy. They struggle often to tell their right hand from their left hand. That's a naming issue rather than orientation issue. And many, not all, but many are ambidextrous.
Wow. Some of those things I haven't heard before. And some of those things I tick and I tick and I tick and I tick. Other ones not so much, but it's like, I mean, even today driving home in the car, I was like, oh, no right turn, looking at a sign that was saying no left turn. But I was like, I couldn't, straight away I was like, no left, no, I saw it pointing that way and was like, oh, no right turn. These things that you're saying that still kind of resonate with me. I'm also interested in this 10% of people, because like what happened with me is I was, for want of a better word, smart enough to skip through school. Yeah. So I was smart enough for my dyslexia to be kind of overpowered, for want of a better word, by my intelligence. Yeah. And so I came out sort of as I was above average, but I came out as not to be worried about, probably a little bit too lazy. But what I've done in this process, and I've just talked about it from my own personal experience, is also figure out about twice exceptionality. What I'm interested as well is the idea of this 10% of people with dyslexia, how many of them are at a point where they really won't be able to do academic or education things without help, versus how many of them are like I was, and was able to function in a school setting. So again, for people, if you missed it, the twice exceptionality is there's various markers for testing how your brain works. I'm very much paraphrasing this. And you can be gifted in some areas and have a learning difficulty or disability in another. And that's called a spiky graph, high on some, low on the others. And what that does is an educational setting, if you don't acknowledge it, it brings it all together and it kind of makes you appear average. And that, I know people who are now working in that field, working towards PhDs in twice exceptionality. And that seems to be something that's also a massive part of our education system, because you've got all these kids going through school who are coming off as average, where actually if they were assessed correctly and had the correct tools, they would be the leaders of the world in 20 years from now. So I guess it's a very long-winded way of saying, in that kind of 10%, what does the research say, or what do you understand where we have people who are kind of skipping through because they're smart enough to do it, versus the ones who really need the help and won't be able to function academically without the help?
Yeah, so a couple of things. First of all, in the New Zealand context, it's a classic example of we don't know what we don't know.
Right.
That figure of 10% is the result really of a whole lot of academics who've been working in this space for the last 10 or 20 years around the world. That's a figure they've come up with. Some places would say that figure is higher, maybe 15%. Some people would say it was lower, but the sort of general consensus is that's 10%. Now, of course, dyslexia, and you've highlighted a really important part. Dyslexia comes with a whole lot of challenges, but it also potentially, and often does, come with a whole lot of positives. And that contributes to that evening out thing that you were talking to about just now. There is another element to this. Before we go to that, most people in New Zealand won't know they have dyslexia. They'll be undiagnosed.
Yep.
Large number of those that have been diagnosed go out of their way to hide it because of a sense of embarrassment. They've got this thing that's to be embarrassed about. Well, that's doubly or triply sad. But the other one I think is very interesting is that you'll be aware, Pat, that most human behavior exists on this typical bell-shaped curve. Or not behavior, but characteristics: height, intelligence, weight, all those other things on the bell curve. The curve for success, if you like, of people with dyslexia is more bimodal. By that we mean there are a lot of people with dyslexia who are incredibly unsuccessful. They're the school dropouts. They're the people that end up behind bars. And I don't know whether you pick up on the fact, but we're talking 50% of prison inmates in New Zealand have dyslexia. Now, when you think about that for a moment, that's actually a national tragedy. It's a country suffering a self-inflicted wound. It's wounding itself by doing this. It's not just New Zealand, of course, it's worldwide. So in America, they talk about the school to prison pipeline.
Right.
When they're talking about neurodiversity. Now that's horrible. That's absolutely horrible that we could contemplate. And it's a reality. What happens is that kids drop out of school. They become NEETs. Are you familiar with the term NEETs?
No. What's NEETs?
Well, here's a good government acronym for you. These are young people not in education, employment, or training.
Oh, okay.
Now, in a cynical moment, I would call these people inmates in waiting. Because they've got a dyslexia rate amongst the ones that I've assessed at around 50% as well. So these are people that are lost. They haven't succeeded in a school environment and they're kind of lost. So that's one thing. The other thing I was going to say to you, dyslexia are either very unsuccessful, and that's those people I've just talked about, or they are at the other end, very successful, with not so many people in the middle. It's not the normal bell-shaped curve. Do you get what I'm driving at?
Right. So it's at either end of the bell shape,
it's
not
either
the
end.
Yeah, gotcha.
So they're either the Richard Bransons or the self-employed business people, and there's a hell of a lot of self-employed tradespeople and others, for example, who have dyslexia. I know a lot of them.
Yeah.
For example, that go home at night and send out their invoices, but they don't write them, they don't type them, they dictate them into Dragon Naturally Speaking or something.
Yeah.
So there is, I mean, that helps a lot. The assistive technologies, of course, help a lot of people. Yeah. But so, that not normal bell shape, not a normal distribution curve is another, I think, interesting facet of the dyslexia world. And there has been research done, and I think this is actually something that educators should be aware of and learners should be aware of. What are the behaviors of people with dyslexia who are very successful?
Yeah.
And comparing those with what are the behaviors of people with dyslexia who are very unsuccessful. And I mean, I think that as educators, that's something we could share with learners. Now, on this whole learning front, it's true that many people with dyslexia have a poor to no understanding of metacognition. Are you aware of what metacognition is?
Well, cognition is to do with the way we think and how the brain operates. Meta, I would think, would be the overarching way we do it.
Right.
Is
So
that
metacognition is a term for not what we learn,
Mhm.
but how we learn.
Right?
People with dyslexia often have very poor metacognition skills. They're clever enough, but they don't know how to learn. They don't have
Right.
good processes.
Right.
And oftentimes that's things like time management and organization skills, planning skills, task initiation skills, and all that kind of thing that makes a really big difference. Yeah.
It seems to me as well, and this is maybe my naivety coming out, but this whole kind of school to prison channel.
Yep.
Now that's a financial cost to the country as well. Obviously, the ambulance at the bottom of the cliff is the prison, but surely the fence at the top of the cliff is successive governments now funding to help these kids find out how to best operate in a setting to not end up in that channel of heading off to prison because they've been given the skills they need to not end up in that path.
Absolutely. Now, the frustration, Pat, is this, that the cost of making a major difference is relatively small
Mm-hmm.
compared to the price of an inmate in jail
Yep.
at $100,000 a year. Let me give you a story that I think typifies this.
Okay.
I screened a woman behind bars. Her name was Lisa. She's mentioned in my book. I don't know whether you know, but I've written a book recently. And she was behind bars. That's the book there.
Yep.
She was behind bars because a judge she'd been caught multiple times driving without a license. And a judge finally got impatient with her and put her behind bars. Now, can you guess as to why she might have not got a driver's license?
Well,
She was dyslexic and couldn't read the theory test.
Right.
Nobody bothered to tell her, by the way, that you can get a reader-writer assistance
Mm-hmm.
for sitting your driver's test. So there's a woman whose biggest aspiration in life was to become a big rig truck driver, and I understand that she was a very good driver. She just didn't have the bit of paper.
Yep.
She was she wasn't in jail for a whole year, but she was in jail at a cost to the taxpayer of $100,000 a year, whereas if she was outside and got a license for a small amount of effort, she could have been a big rig truck driver and enjoying her life.
And paying tax and putting money back into the coffers. Yeah, of course.
So some of the changes that make a big difference, the assistive technology, by the way, which does make a really big difference, is getting cheaper by the day, and much of it is free and readily available on a regular laptop as we speak. Some professional development for teachers would make a big difference.
Mm-hmm.
But like I said at the outset, it's an issue that we don't know what we don't know. And the petition that started this off effectively, Pat, is a call to do something about that.
So let's just wrap up with that. There is messaging on the petition there. Support dyslexia and neurodiversity on education, health, especially mental health, justice and incarceration rates, social well-being and employment, the workplace and workplace productivity. What do you want to see come from this petition now that it's been presented to Parliament?
I want to see a number of things. I'd like to see a public education program because, of course, dyslexia and neurodiverse conditions are either invisible or poorly understood.
Uh-huh.
I'd like there to be some sort of economic inquiry into the cost to New Zealand of ignoring it, because the case is very compelling. I'd like to see some changes to the education legislation about training our teachers and about professional development and supporting this 10% of learners. And most of all, I'd like some legislation because, of course, it's missing in any form of legislation. So it's not I've worked a lot with government agencies, Pat, and I have to tell you that they're very, very predictable people and they follow the rules because they're scared to put their head above the parapet.
Right.
It isn't in their it isn't in their lexicon. It isn't in their terms of reference. It's not something they even think about. Now, for example, MB, the government agency responsible for workplace training and productivity, along with the Productivity Commission, I can't even get an audience there. They don't know what they don't know there either. They should be all over this like a rash, because
Yeah.
it's, I mean, what's the big issue in New Zealand apart from COVID and our health problems? We have low productivity. We work harder than everyone else, but our productivity rate is very low. Well, of course it's bloody low. 10% of the population are underemployed. But the other side of that, the gifted nature of them, their skills and talents, I could go on at length about, and you're an example of someone who's got some of those skills and talents, they often lay dormant, because even if they have them, they're often undeveloped, because people have just got the mind, and this is a lot about mindset, they've got a mindset that they're thick and stupid.
Yeah.
And that's really, really unacceptable. And I don't think it's not equitable, and it's causing us productivity problems, Pat.
Let me say this as well, Mike, as we wrap up. Parents out there, if you see something in your child that your school doesn't pick up on, i.e. if you like, hang on, my kid's not a, whatever the new gradings are, but my kid's not an average child. I think my kid's more than that. Then I would really encourage you to look further into it. No one will be an advocate for your child other than you. And I think too often in polite society, we're worried about being a soccer mom or a Karen or a Ken, saying that our darlings are perfect when they're not. But I would say to parents, if you think it, speak it out, because who knows, you might be right, and you might be actually doing something positive for your kid. That might be the one thing you need to do to then move into a successful academic career. Should that be what the kid wants to do? Like, I'm always about, you want the options. Not every kid wants to go to university. Not every kid wants to do that. They may have other things on their mind. But I think that in an ideal world, we want to get to the end of our schooling, for example, if I'm just talking about schooling, and have the options to do what we want, not the options taken away from us because we haven't been served correctly within that school or schooling system.
Absolutely. And the biggest sort of telltale sign for parents, Pat, is if there is a discrepancy between how capable your son seems to be orally, and then the big discrepancy between how poor they are with writing and spelling. That's often the big telltale sign.
Yeah. Very cool. Hey, Mike, it's been lovely to speak to you. If people want to find out more about you, I always struggle that the word dyslexia is so hard to spell, but dyslexia-consulting.com. We need a new name for it. Dyslexia-consulting.com is your website, Mike Stiles, adult dyslexia practitioner. Hey, thanks for joining us today. I really appreciate what you're doing. I appreciate the work you're doing, because actually what you're doing is also, although, you know, one of my kids is through school, I've got two who are still in school. The work you're doing now will impact not only my kids, but future generations to come. So thank you, sir, for the work you're doing. I appreciate it. And thanks for coming on the show tonight.
Thank you, Pat. Lovely to talk to you.